Hello, and welcome to the presentation for week 10. It is week 10 already. We have 6 weeks left after this, and the semester will be wrapping up, so we're making good headway here. Um, this week we are reading So Long, See You Tomorrow. It's I think one of only two times during the class that we will read uh, a whole book in 1 week. But it's a short book, it's more of a novella, really. And I will confess right up front that if you put a gun to my head and said, "What's your favorite book of all time?" this is probably going to be it. Um, I do not expect all of you to feel the same way by the end of this week, but I think it's a book that has a lot of interesting stuff going on, both literarily and specifically as it relates to the rural. Um, I want to start, and I'm going to try to go a little quicker through these slides because since I've condensed this book into 1 week, when I think on site it's about a week and a half. There are quite a few slides this week, so after all of this perfunctory introduction that I'm going through now, I'm going to try to move a little quicker on as many slides as I can. So I'd like to start by discussing William Maxwell himself, the author. He's not as well known as some of the authors that we've read. Those of you who recognize Toni Morrison or Edith Wharton or Sherwood Anderson may have never heard of William Maxwell. Um, he's sort of a writer's writer. A lot of people who study writing and are fiction writers tend to be big fans of William Maxwell. He's studied more by writers than by literary critics, I think. Um, he was born William Keepers Maxwell Jr. in the actual town of Lincoln, Illinois, in August 1908. So he is writing about the town that he was born in and grew up in. He grew up both in Lincoln and in Bloomington, Illinois, and then later he moved to Chicago in his teens, which if you have done your reading already, know happens in the book as well. He later moved to New York City, became fiction editor of the New Yorker magazine, which is sort of one of the great fiction magazines in American literature. He was a famous author in his own right, but he became famous also for mentoring other young authors who became famous. So Nabokov, Updike, Salinger, Cheever, Welty, names that actually now are probably more recognizable than William Maxwell. He helped them become professional writers. He didn't publish a lot in his lifetime, and he lived to a ripe old age, but he only published 6 novels, um, some story collections, and some nonfiction. So Long See You Tomorrow is probably Maxwell's most famous work, although he has a short story collection. I think it's called All the Days and Nights, which is also very well regarded. But So Long See You Tomorrow was published in 1980. So Maxwell was into his 70s by the time the book was published. It won multiple awards. It won the National Book Award. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. And Michael Ondaatje, who wrote The English Patient, and whose blurb you probably have seen on the front cover of the book that you bought, says, "This is one of the great books of our age. It is the subtlest of miniatures that contains our deepest sorrows and truths and love, all caught in a clear, simple style in perfect brushstrokes." It really is, in its own, I think, fairly small way, taking place in a small Midwestern town, sort of the perfect novel or novella. Um, and it has gained a lot of respect from other writers. So if you've started reading So Long See You Tomorrow, and certainly if you have finished it, you probably noticed it seems like a strange sort of book. Not that it's hard to understand, not that the story that it tells is complicated, but it's a book that is sort of fiction and nonfiction at the same time. Uh, William Maxwell tells the story of growing up in Lincoln, Illinois, and he tells it basically as a true story. He talks about things that happened when his mother died, when his brother was injured, when his father remarried. These are true stories, at least in the general sense of the word true. Um, so at first, it's like memoir, it's autobiography, but at other times, as he starts to explore the events that surround sort of the murder in this town and how those families deal with it, he has no record of these things happening. He has no record of these people doing these things and saying these things other than the murder itself. And yet he tells that story as well, inventing it to a large extent to try to make sense of it. So it is a hybrid of nonfiction and fiction. And Maxwell makes no bones about that, as we're going to look at. So this is a story that's been described as autobiographical metafiction. Meta just means, fiction that is aware and points out that it's fiction. Maxwell himself is the main character in the book. Not an imaginary version of Maxwell, but the actual Maxwell that grew up in Lincoln. And at first, as I said, it follows his own memories of his own childhood, but later it becomes made up, it becomes fictional, it becomes not really the truth, small t, truth, Truth. But we're going to talk later, I think, about capital T truth and whether things can be true without being a verifiable fact. This is something that the book is very interested in. So, some questions or some thoughts to keep in mind as you're reading the book or reflecting on it. I know a lot of you like to do the reading before you watch these presentations, and I think that probably is the best way to do it. But regardless, how important is objective truth in telling this story? Objective truth means the real, verifiable, it can be proven truth. And what moments does the real objective truth become more and less important in this story? It's not always valued at the same level as the novel continues. It's also worth considering what the effect is of Lincoln, the town, being characterized through distant memory. We've talked a lot about how rural culture likes to imagine itself not changing. And that lack of change, but also eventual change, as Maxwell has grown to be an older man by the 1970s and into the 80s, is important here. No rural place doesn't ever change. They just change slowly, and because of that, they are resistant to change. And finally, something you can always ask when you read a book in this class: how does Lincoln compare to the other towns we have seen elsewhere? How does Lincoln compare to Winesburg? How does it compare to Medallion? How does it compare to Starkfield? These are questions worth asking. So we're just going to move sort of chapter by chapter, and because this is a book we're reading in 1 week, we're going to move through all the chapters during this presentation. So chapter 1 is a pistol shot. It sort of gives a little bit of information about the murder that takes place, and then we will leave that and come back to it later in the book. But notice, Maxwell starts the story with the facts, the testimony and information that has been entered into the record during the trial. And I want you to consider what the effect of this approach is. It really sets this up as almost a true crime sort of novel. If you ever watch those true crime shows on cable, they're often set in rural locations, and it's about, the boyfriend with the past where he murdered somebody, or the wife who murders her husband to get the insurance money. It almost sets itself up as that story, although as you continue to read, it becomes something much more complex and sort of complicated than a just the fact sort of story. But it plants its flag there at the beginning. Also notice this line on page 4, talking about sort of the information being shared. We get this line, "Who believes children?" And while that might seem like a throwaway line on page 4, I would argue this is an important thematic line within the book as a whole. Children don't get believed. The ways that children view the world are not valued. In fact, notice here, it's not a question. He's not asking who believes children. He's saying, who believes children? The implication being people don't believe children. And yet, the loss and the longing of more than one child in this book is central, but it's not understood by the adults. And finally, and I'm not going to go through this, but feel free to open your books to page 5 and look at the first glimpse of Lincoln that we get. What's familiar here? What have we seen in the other rural settings that we've read about? What's new? What's not familiar here as opposed to the other places that we've read about? If you go back through your memory of the books we've read, Starkfield is Massachusetts. Winesburg is northern Ohio. The town in Bless Me Ultima is the desert southwest of New Mexico. Sula is again sort of northern Ohio. And now we're in sort of north central Illinois, which might actually be more familiar to a lot of you here, because Terre Haute is sort of set on that same plane. Those of you who are sort of campus students, some of you I'm sure are nowhere close to Terre Haute and don't know what it looks like, but Lincoln shares characteristics with these other rural places, but also I think is different in some ways, and it's worth making some notes and considering that. Then we move into the next chapter, the period of mourning. This chapter deals almost exclusively with young William Maxwell autobiographically. It deals with the death of his mother and the effect of that on his family. Um, and because of that, it really centers on, one, the actual death of his mother, and then it deals with the fallout of that, which in his case is how to connect with his father without his mother um, present to help mediate that relationship. So, right out of the gate in this chapter, I want to draw your attention to the idea of change and the resistance to change. This should be familiar to you. We've talked about this in relation to rural culture and the rural experience generally. In Sula, the change that Sula brought back to the town was resisted by the town. They didn't want change, they didn't trust her difference. Um, in Starkfield, Ethan Frome wanted to take off with Maddie, but not only financially could he not do that, but there was also a resistance to doing what was not accepted in the town. A lot of resistance to change in Winesburg, a lot of traditions and resistance to change in Bless Me Ultima. When the brothers come back embracing change, it really upsets the stability of the family and to some extent the town. So this is a very rural characteristic. I think this chapter captures the sadness of change in a rural environment extremely well. So right out of the gate, we get the passage that says, in that sad house where nothing ever changed." The implication being, um, you know, everything was sort of preserved. The sadness, the death, was preserved. Um, and then we also get this passage on page 9 as Maxwell tries to make sense of the death of his mother. It says, "I had to find an explanation other than the real one, which was that we were no more immune to misfortune than anybody else. And the idea that kept recurring to me, perhaps because of that pacing the floor with my father, was that I had inadvertently walked through a door that I shouldn't have gone through and couldn't get back to the place I hadn't meant to leave." Not only is that lovely writing, but it's the central metaphor of the book that Maxwell feels that he, as this young boy, accidentally stepped through a door and now can never find his way back through the door. Not only does it work as a metaphor, but it begins a sort of connection to architecture that we're going to see persist through the book. But this idea that he took one step too many and now cannot backtrack, that he created the change without realizing it could never be undone. And that, of course, is not only a universal metaphor that works, for anyone who has experienced trauma or death, that once this happens, you can never go back to the way it was. But I think it also works as sort of a metaphor for the rural experience. And connected to this idea of change and resistance to change, we get this passage also on page 9, where he says, "Children tend to derive comfort and support from the totally familiar." Well, something can only be totally familiar if it, to some extent, is unchanging. Right? You don't get to know something that is constantly changing. The house you live in is totally familiar because you don't notice it changing very much. You might hang a new picture on the wall, but if I walk into my house at night, even if I close my eyes during the day, I can mostly get where I'm going because it doesn't change. The stairs are still where they are. The kitchen is still where it's at. The handle on the refrigerator has not moved. But the implication here is if children tend to derive comfort and support from the totally familiar, and I would argue so do rural cultures, not that they are childlike necessarily, what happens when the familiarity is removed? For Maxwell, the loss of his mother defamiliarizes everything. And then in his attempt to cope with the death of his wife, Maxwell's father defamiliarizes things further. We get this on page 10. "He gave away her jewelry, and more important to me, her clothes, so I could no longer open her closet door and look at them." Think of Maxwell the child, desperately seeking stability, some reminder of his mother, and his father's way of coping is to get everything that reminds him of her out of the house, and suddenly young Maxwell is at sea. He is defamiliarized to the extent that he has lost his bearing. And while we're talking about central metaphors that take place in this book or are useful to note in this book, um, his father has one of the few pictures of his mother touched up. Now remember, this is a time when photographs were not necessarily easy to come by, and there weren't many of them. And he takes the picture of the mother uh, to, I don't even know what you would call it. I guess a photo touch-upper. That's the technical term. And what he does is he has the artist change it so that she looks more like a mature woman. I don't know if this is because the father wants her to appear to have aged with him or what's going on. But it says the picture didn't satisfy my father either, and he got the photographer who had taken it to touch it up so she would look more like a mature woman. So, not only does Maxwell lose his mother, but he begins to lose any way of keeping an accurate memory of her. Because of this change, he is losing what he came from. In this case, his mother. But again, it maps onto the idea of the rural, right? One of the reasons people fear things changing in the rural is because they will no longer have what they are used to. Um, and because change is slower, people have much more time to get attached, right? The grocery store building in the small town in southern Indiana where I grew up burned, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And when that happened, it was shocking because that building had been there for 70 years. People had been born and died and lived a whole life with it there, and suddenly it wasn't there. So sort of that same effect. And then we get this. The retouched photograph came between me and the face I remembered, and it got harder and harder to recall my mother as she really was. Now, the father seems very cruel at this point, but I would argue there's a sympathetic reading of him where he is coping in his own way as well. He has also lost someone. He's just not considering how his sons will react to this as well as he could. And I think another really centrally important passage, not just to this chapter, but to the book, comes on page 12. As he is trying to figure out how to cope with the loss and the change, he says, I also clung to the idea that if things remained exactly the way they were, if we were careful not to take a step in any direction from the place where we were now, we would somehow get back to the way it was before she died. So this is clearly a personal reaction. But I think it's also a great example of the conservative, and I don't mean politically conservative, tendencies of rural cultures. If we just manage to keep things the way they were, if we don't move too far away from it, we can always find our way back. Now, we could debate whether that is a positive or a negative, a useful or a non-productive attitude to have, but that seems almost secondary because it is an attitude that he has, and it is an attitude to some extent that rural cultures have. So I think it's a way of understanding both the character and these cultures, not a judgment of whether they are good or effective or whatever. And finally, at the end of this chapter, we get a passage that I think is also really revealing. It's old William Maxwell in the 1970s writing this story in his, what would it be? Probably his late 50s, early 60s. Looking back through the pictures and mementos of his childhood, pictures of him, pictures of his mother, pictures of his father. And he says, and looking at these faded snapshots, I see, or rather, the child that survives in me sees with a pang that I am old enough to be that man's father, speaking of his father. And he has been dead for nearly 20 years, and yet it troubles me that he was happy. Why? In some way, his happiness was, at that time, and forever after it would seem, a threat to me. It was not the kind of happiness that children are included in, but why that should trouble me now, I do not even begin to understand it. So my question about this passage isn't so much about understanding the characters or the rural, but it's worth asking what's the effect of the retrospective narrator? This is just a literary term. When a story is narrated by someone looking back on the story later in time, in this case much later, what's the effect of that? How is this a different story than it would be if it were being told by sort of the Huck Finn version of Maxwell as a young boy telling it as it happened? And I think one of the things it does is it does create this sort of wistfulness, this sort of nostalgia for this time, even though he wasn't very happy during this time, but he remembers it in a way that is, I think, wistful. And that, again, is sort of characteristic of the rural view of the past. Right? You can go to any small town, certainly in Indiana, but I think lots of places, and find people that will still talk about how great the team that made it to the championship game in the state basketball contest or football contest was, right? As if it happened yesterday. And it's also worth asking how it mirrors or deflates the common rural mindset of the good old days, because those talks about the basketball or football are very purely rose colored, remembering it as if it was the best thing ever. Maxwell's not really doing that here. He's not remembering good times. He's actually remembering bad times, but he's still managing to do it in a sort of wistful, longing way. Then we move into the next chapter called The New House. And this is where we meet Cletus. And it's also sort of the story of what happens after the mourning period, right? After Maxwell's mother has died and been buried, and his father has met someone else and has remarried, and they build a new house. And in telling the story of that new house, Maxwell says on page 24, he says, "I've always had the impression that Lincoln was in some way different from the others, but perhaps that is only because I lived there." The idea that everybody thinks their small town is special and unique because they're experiencing it. It's that insider view of the small town. When in reality, if you get in your car and leave your small town and then drive through 20 other small towns on the way somewhere else, they all look the same because you are no longer an insider. So the rural perspective is definitely affected or colored by whether you have sort of a native view or an outsider view. And then we also learn here that Maxwell says, "My father found most old things oppressive." So when you compare this to the narrator's desire to have nothing change, you start to see the nature of the disconnection between father and son here. The son wants everything to go back the way it was. The father wants everything new and shiny and completely changed. And to some extent, this is a difference between a traditional and a more I guess, modern idea of the rural. Now, the thing to do in small towns is get a grant and rebuild your main street, right? But some people really resist that. Okay, now I want to take a minute to discuss a piece of art that gets discussed in the book. Maxwell makes repeated reference to the palace at 4 a.m. And as you were reading, you might have sort of scratched your head and said, what's the palace at 4 a.m.? Well, it's a sculpture, and I believe it's in the New York Museum of Modern Art. And this is an actual picture of the sculpture Maxwell refers to. He first refers to it describing himself and Cletus Smith playing in the framework of the house his father is building, that Maxwell's father is building, before they've put all of the accoutrements on it. This is just the frame of the house, and they climb around on it and play with each other. And it reminds him of this sculpture. And I think you can see why. But start asking yourself, if the author is going to bring a work of art into the book, he is, of course, inviting us to read it sort of symbolically or metaphorically. So look at this and ask yourself, how is this sculpture reflecting what we've read in the book so far? What's the symbolism here? And I think one thing you can say is, well, this is a book very much about pulling back this sort of familiarity and examining the bare bones of this life, this rural experience. So this fits that. And it's also sort of about getting to the bare bones or the facts of the murder in later chapters, and this sort of fits that. You also notice on the left side, there is sort of a vaguely feminine figure standing by the three white panels, and that certainly could represent the missing maternal figure or Maxwell's mother in the story. So some considerations there. It also just works as a nice visual aid for what, a frame house would look like. Okay, so now we're at a moment where I think people sort of stop and scratch their heads sometimes when they get to this. And this is, I think, Maxwell's way of starting to introduce us to the idea that he is not going to just tell you the story that he remembers, but he is going to actually have to create part of the story to make sense of the facts. So he says, what we, or at any rate what I, refer to confidently as memory, meaning a moment, a scene, a fact that has been subjected to a fixative and thereby rescued from oblivion, is really a form of storytelling that goes on continually in the mind and often changes with the telling. Too many conflicting emotional interests are involved for life ever to be wholly acceptable. And possibly it is the work of the storyteller to rearrange things so that they conform to this end. In any case, in talking about the past, we lie with every breath we draw. So, I usually, when I'm teaching this in class, this is my wait, what does that even mean moment? But all he's really saying is what we consider to be verifiable memory is never really reliable memory. The more we remember things, the more we associate them with the things that make us remember, the more we conflate them with other memories we have. There isn't really such a thing as a true memory, right? I remember seeing Star Wars at a drive-in when I was a kid, but then I realized that I couldn't have been more than 3 years old. So I don't really remember it. I remember images from it. I don't have any context for them. Our brain creates that, right? So I think that's what he's talking about here. And it gives him permission to start to invent this story and to try to make sense of this murder, this town, this rural existence by telling a story about it. Okay, so in the school corridor, the chapter, shorter chapter, serves as sort of a transition between the story of Maxwell and the story of Cletus and Cletus's parents and the neighboring parents. And the setup, and really the root of the title In the School Corridor, is that eventually William Maxwell and his father and his stepmother moved to Chicago. And Maxwell started going to a big Chicago urban school. And he tells us a little bit about it. And then we get to this moment where he's at one end of the hallway walking between classes, and he looks up, and coming the opposite direction is Cletus. And they see each other, but they don't speak. And this really becomes one of the primary moments of the entire book. And he says here, I have a hazy half recollection, which I do not trust, of sitting and staring at Cletus's empty desk at school. At the school in Lincoln before everybody left. After the murder, when Cletus would have been taken out of school. This is the first sentence of the chapter. I have a hazy half recollection, which I do not trust, of sitting and staring at Cletus's empty desk at school. Now I ask on the slide here, what's the effect of this sentence starting the chapter? Well, it starts us down the slippery slope of small t verifiable truth versus big T sort of universal truth. He says from the get-go in this sentence that this may not have even ever happened, and yet he talks about it as if it did. So that helps prepare us for where the book is going to go. Also in this chapter, we get a very short sentence that also seems significant in our study of the rural. Maxwell tells us that the new house that his father built, was too new to be comfortable. Think about that. Too new to be comfortable. Most of us today would love to have a new house. For young Maxwell, though, it was too new to be comfortable. It wasn't established enough. It was too much of a change. Compare this with Maxwell's thoughts back in chapter 2, that children find comfort in what's familiar, in what's old, in what's established. That's the problem with this house. Also, note the sort of symbolic juxtaposition that Maxwell's physical house is being completed, just as Cletus's emotional home is being destroyed by the murder. And while you're at it, just for fun, consider how often we conflate the terms house and home. Right? A house is a structure. A home is something more than a structure. Especially, I think, in rural places where homes survive for generations. Another side observation here before we get back to the main thread of the story and the plot. Discussing growing up in this house, Maxwell says, I had a one-tube radio set in my room, on the desk where I studied. Above it, on the wall, was a map of North America, with colored pins for all the radio stations I had picked up. The pin that gave me the most pleasure was stuck at Havana, Cuba, which I only got once. And that might have seemed, I don't know, a throwaway line, or maybe even not very believable, a Cuba radio station reaching central Illinois, although it absolutely does happen with AM stations. How do you read this passage in light of our discussions of rural isolation, which we've talked about in Weinsberg and Ethan Frome, really all of the texts so far? The idea that we've now reached a point where we can have a radio in our room that starts to bring the outside world in to this isolated rural place. It, of course, is the forerunner of later the television and now the internet, right? Rural places aren't isolated the way they were once. And we start to see that break down here. We also get the reference here in the house where Maxwell's father and stepmother, they build it, they all move in. Um, Maxwell says there was enough self-control in that household for 6 families. The idea being that self-control, propriety, appearance is hugely important. Where have we seen this elsewhere? I would say to some extent in every book we've read, because this is characteristic of the rural. Um, it also, I think, might be more Midwestern than any other kind of rural. The Midwestern culture is very interesting in that it really, I would argue, and maybe I've said this in other presentations, that keeping everybody content and happy and non-confrontational is often more important than getting to the truth of things. In some places, getting to the true story is more important than keeping people happy. I think often in the Midwest, people are perfectly happy to bury family secrets for generations if it means no conflict, right? Um, this is certainly not true of all Midwesterners, probably not as true as it would have once been, but I think there is still some truth to that. Also in this chapter, Maxwell's family moves to Chicago, and I think it's worth also considering how the city is characterized here. We've looked at how the city is characterized in Winesburg and in Sula, where the city really wasn't all it was cut out to be. Here, it actually sort of seems to be. Maxwell is much happier in his school in Chicago. So the idea of getting out of the small town into the city here isn't really as dangerous as we have seen it elsewhere. It's really ultimately sort of rewarding. And as support for this rewarding shift to the urban, we get this passage about going to school in Chicago. After Labor Day, I started to school in a city high school of 3,000 students where there was so much going on after school: band practice, fencing, the stamp collectors club, the history club, the French club, the players, the orchestra, the camera club, the chess and checker club, the architectural society, and so on. The failure to do well in sports didn't make you an object of derision. Once, in an outdoor gym class, a football came through the air and I managed to hang on to it. This was long after the class had stopped expecting me to catch anything, and there was general rejoicing and disbelief, but they never rode me. I was accepted for what I was. It was, after all, not a small town, but a big city. And in that school, there was no one who was not accepted. So, 2 important things going on here, at least. First, the change Maxwell had actually resisted is happening, and he actually seems happy with it. So that complicates our idea of change and resistance to change in rural. Second, we're getting commentary on the differences between rural and urban here. So how do you interpret this commentary? I already sort of mentioned that the urban is coming off looking better here than it has elsewhere. So here, the urban experience really is the great equalizer, the great opportunity provider. So, as I said, it's really at the beginning of the chapter. Now we're there. The chapter ends with Maxwell encountering Cletus Smith in the school hallway and passing him without a word. And Maxwell ultimately suggests that this memory of passing Cletus and not being able to open his mouth and say anything to this person that he knew went through this awful thing is the reason he wrote the book. Why? What really, ultimately, is at stake in this moment, and why has it stuck with him many, many years? And I don't just mean, when he sees him later in high school, but in the 1970s, when he is an old man writing this book. We all have those memories that stick with us long after they probably should have. But why is this one of those? What still bothers or plagues or upsets Maxwell about this moment? And I think it largely is that he couldn't say anything. That all he needed to do was reach out in that most rural, most human of ways and offer a word of comfort. And he doesn't do it. And it becomes, I think, at least within the pages of this book, maybe his greatest regret in life. And consider that also as you consider this passage from the next chapter. He says, "If I knew where Cletus Smith is right this minute, I would go and explain, or try to. It is not only possible, but more than likely, that I would also have to explain who I am, and that he would have no recollection of the moment that has troubled me all these years. He lived through things that were a good deal worse. it might turn out that I had made the effort for my sake, not his. And so we start to understand that in some ways this is about Cletus Smith, but in some ways it's really about William Maxwell and William Maxwell's loss of his mother, of his childhood, and wanting to commiserate with someone else who has lost similarly. So, as we shift to the next chapter, the emotion of ownership, a passage that I want to bring up is the one where young William Maxwell is on a drive with his father. They're going through the countryside. Um, and he says, "By nature home loving, I looked at the houses instead, how bleak they were compared to our house in town. No big shade trees, no wide front porch to sit on, no neighbors all up and down the street." And this is an important reminder that there are degrees of rurality, that there isn't simply one monolithic rural culture. And even within towns, there are the people in town, the people outside of town. Um, and I would ask you to consider, how does this seem familiar or different from where we have seen this elsewhere, say in Bless Me Ultima or Winesburg, Ohio? And in the same general area, excuse me, we get this section describing sort of the farm life in this area of Illinois. And it says, "The black, fertile soil of Logan County was, and so far as I know still is, owned by people whose ancestors came from Kentucky or Indiana or Ohio, bringing with them no more than they could fit into a lurching covered wagon. They staked out as much land as they had a fancy to clear to and cleared it slowly, putting a few more acres under cultivation each year. Their children and grandchildren born on this land felt they belonged there." So my question for you is, we've talked about the American dream. Is this the American dream? The idea of setting out, staking your claim, working the land, hard labor, and then you have something to leave to your children and grandchildren? I think this possibly is one of the more optimistic definitions of the American dream. And yet, here we are, continuing the story we saw in the previous slide. Their great grandchildren either sold their patrimony or got someone else to farm it for them. Living in town quite comfortably in big old houses set well back from the street, they kept an eye on what was going on out in the country. And when the crops were delivered at the grain elevator, they took, as was customary, half the profits. They did not consider a tenant farmer their social equal, any more than a carpenter or a stonemason or a bricklayer. The farmer who owned the land he farmed, they could and did accept. So, what about this side of the American dream? Those grandchildren of the people who staked their claim and built their farm have now moved into town, but because they own the land, they can split the profits with the people that actually do the farming the way their grandparents would have. Um, I would say this is maybe the darker side of the American dream, but it's not uncommon in rural areas, especially today. If you drive up and down Highway 41 as it runs through Terre Haute on the north and south ends, you see these big farms that are very often not owned by the people who are farming them. You should also ask yourself, how is this different or maybe similar to the social stratification we've seen in other texts? The sort of class. Here, the landowners consider themselves a higher class than the tenant farmers. And I think we have seen versions of that elsewhere. We saw higher and lower class people in Winesburg, and to some extent in Ethan Frome. And so this chapter, The Emotion of Ownership, really is where Maxwell is making the transition from his sort of autobiographical story of his childhood and his father and Lincoln into, I guess, for lack of a better term, the fictional account of the true story murder that took place. So this murder really happened. I think that has been made clear, but if it wasn't, the murder that Cletus's dad committed on his neighbor, this really happened. You can go to Lincoln, Illinois today and look it up in the newspaper. But to make sense of it, to try to get all the details sorted out and find meaning in it, Maxwell now comes right out and tells us he's going to make this story up. In fact, he says, "If any part of the following mixture of truth and fiction strikes the reader as unconvincing, he has my permission to disregard it. I would be content to stick to the facts if there were any." So, this is his attempt to justify the fiction he's bringing into the mix. Is he successful? I mean, I think he is in the sense that he's upfront about it. He's not trying to pull the wool over your eyes, and he's making it clear that he's interested in something beyond the small t truth. He's looking for the big T, capital T, sort of philosophical truth behind these events. And the only way to get that is to imagine how it may have happened. And then, once he's given himself permission to do this, he's off. He invents the dog, the cattle, the contents of the kitchen. Um, so, how would you describe the invented home for Cletus Smith that Maxwell invents? Because he didn't know the house, it wouldn't be there anymore. He didn't know these people, really, except for Cletus. Is it too realistic? Is it too rose colored? And we even get this passage: the dog knows better than to try and sneak into the house with him, but that doesn't mean she likes being kept out. So now we're in the point of view of the dog. Clearly invented. Um, I don't think I have to explain how he couldn't actually know what the dog was thinking. But why? What does this accomplish? Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of possible answers to this. One is to steep us in the details of a familiar rural existence, that of the sharecropper. But I think it also creates sympathy. It also makes the events that did happen, the murder, um, carry more weight than if it were simply newspaper reportage. So to find the capital T truth effect of all of this, he has to create this world. Another thing worth pointing out is it's very easy to read the first half of this book as William Maxwell's story and the second half of this book as Cletus's story. But on page 59, we get this. We get that in the imagined version of Cletus Smith's childhood, Cletus likes Mrs. Wilson, the neighbor's wife, quote, because she is always the same. And I don't think you have to, be an expert in literary criticism to naturally compare this to Maxwell's recollections of his own childhood. So then you start to ask yourself, well, is this the Cletus story, or is this Maxwell imagining Cletus's childhood in an attempt to reimagine his own? Perhaps somewhat more favorably. I mean, obviously not the murder, but this seems like a very happy place compared to the home for Maxwell that we see early in the novel. So as we start to get Lloyd Wilson's story, also the title of this chapter, we get this. You didn't have to be much of a judge of character to see that the woman had been hoping for something better, and the man was being patient with her. She didn't seem to know what to do at first. Brought up in town, he said to himself. Now, you can certainly ask, how are we supposed to read this in relationship to what happens afterwards, and how this might be a natural cause of a split between these two. But I think it's also worth reading that he sees her as fundamentally different, even though they're from basically the same place, because she was brought up in town and he was not. So, at this point, we have received this story through lots of points of view. Maxwell's own autobiographical point of view, Cletus Smith's point of view, Lloyd Wilson's point of view, and even, for a moment here and there, Cletus's dog. So what's the effect of this shifting between characters and also between truth and fiction? How are we meant to read this novel as a whole? And I think it's also worth asking, how does it affect our reading of the rural here? That there is the sort of true rural, in as much as his memories of his childhood can be true, and the imagined rural. And are they the same? Are they different? So we're actually dealing with multiple versions of rural in a single book. How does it compare to, say, the way we get all the points of view in Weinsberg? Because that is also a book where we get lots of points of view. But I feel like point of view and separate point of views are used differently in the two books. Um, and for that matter, does it matter that Maxwell, as the author, is still intrusively present in all of these points of view? He will often stop to editorialize and discuss how he does or doesn't remember certain things about the town. How does that affect things? We certainly don't really get that with George Willard, if we accept him as the narrator of Weinsberg. He's very much in the moment, whereas Maxwell is looking back 60 years later. And returning momentarily, we're jumping to the next chapter here. But there's a scene where Lloyd is giving his kids a bath because his wife has left. And it says that he poured soapy water over their thin shoulders as he had seen their mother do, and examined their ears for dirt, but his hands were not as gentle or as practiced as hers. And Dean looked at him accusingly and said, "You hurt me." "Do it yourself then," he said. But he was damned if he was going to let them grow up in town, not knowing how to handle an axe or plow a straight furrow. Very revealing moment in sort of the nuance of the rural. What does this reveal about the split between town and country in rural settings? And I think one of the immediate things it reveals is that people outside of town view those in the town as soft, as not as able to sort of take care of themselves and take care of their own property and materials. And to some extent, I think this also is true of rural people generally in the way they view, say, those in the suburbs or those in the city. Um, just as an example, I changed the brake pads on the front brakes of my car the other day, and I was telling somebody I work with here at the university about it. And you would think I had told them I had split the atom, right? Where because of my background, changing brake pads isn't terribly complicated. Um, but in a city, even the size of Terre Haute, many people would rather go and pay to have somebody do that for them because they didn't need to learn how. Now, that isn't to say one is right and one is wrong. That they probably have more time, spare time, on a day that they take it to the shop than I do on a day when I do it myself. So there's a trade-off. But I think it suggests something about the split between not just rural and urban, but more and less rural, as characterized here. This is another one of those passages that I think carries a lot of significance because uh, Lloyd Wilson, his wife has left him, and so Cletus's mother wants to run across the field to Lloyd because they have had an affair and they've called it off because of the complications they've caused. But in this moment, uh, the narrator asks, with Lloyd Wilson's wife now gone, what prevented her, uh, Cletus's mother, running what prevented her from throwing a shawl over her shoulders and running across the field to his house? In other words, what kept them from finally, at long last, just simply being together? And the answer that the text gives is the whole community. Think about that. The whole community is what's keeping them from being together. Why? And then we get this. People will only stand so much. And there is a line that you can't cross over, no matter how much you would like to. If he did cross over it, and he got a letter informing him that after the 1st of March, Mrs. Stroud had no further need for his services, where would they go then? Who would take him on as a tenant when they found out that he was living with a woman who was not his wife? Their courage failed them. So on both sides of the fence, so to speak, it's not their lack of passion or love or whatever for each other. It's the fact that they are part of a community, and that community will not react well to this breaking of their community's norms. And I don't think I have to point it out to you, but I will, that we've seen this pretty much everywhere. Ethan Frome can't head west with Maddie, not just because he's poor, but because it would be unacceptable to the community of Starkfield. Many characters in Winesburg, Ohio, choose not to act on impulse because they know it would not be accepted in the town. Think of Sula. She does actually go against the norms of the town. And how does the town react? They label her as evil. They ostracize her. So while it's true that any culture, urban, rural, or otherwise, is going to have rules and you're going to be expected to adhere to them, there are much more detailed, much more sort of, I don't want to say conservative because that brings politics into it. I don't mean politically conservative, but sort of socially conservative rules that it can't be crossed. Whereas in many urban places, there are the rules on the books and that's it. In rural places, there are often many, many unspoken rules that have maybe sometimes less than anticipated results. And that's what's holding these two apart here. So that's some information about how the rural setting affects these characters and how they view each other and how they behave. But don't overlook on a purely sort of craft level as far as how fiction is put together in this case. Setting also affects plot. So we get this, that in a town the size of Lincoln, there are no well-kept secrets. Somebody told somebody who told somebody who told somebody who told Clarence about the fat letters with no return address that Fern dropped in the big green box in front of the post office after dark. It didn't take very long for this to happen, or for Fern to find out that Clarence knew. So the small town setting where everyone knows everyone actually causes the plot to develop. It causes people to know things about each other that they probably wouldn't in a different setting. So the rural setting here, certainly we've spent the best part of the semester talking about how it shapes characters, but it also shapes plot. This wouldn't happen elsewhere in a less rural setting. I said earlier how the story of Cletus that Maxwell invents can often be read as Maxwell coping with or trying to make sense of his own story, his own upbringing. On page 113, we get a passage that is easily read in that way. It says, "Take all of this away, and what have you done to him? If you take his home away, in the face of a deprivation so great, what is the use of asking him to go on being the boy he was? He might as well start life over again as some other boy instead." Now, he is ostensibly talking about Cletus after the murder and his home falling apart. But he's just as well talking about his own experience after his mother's death. How can you possibly ask him to go on being the boy he was after being deprived of his mother? So, the second half of this book is about Cletus and the murder. But it's also very much still about Maxwell trying to make sense of something as basic as the loss of his mother at a young age. So as this chapter starts to come to a close, Clarence Smith's wife has left him. His children are no longer with him. His life is falling apart. And yet he has not yet murdered Lloyd Wilson. And we get this as one of the final examinations before Clarence Smith sort of makes his fateful choice. It was the time of year when the man usually sawed up fallen trees and split the logs and filled the woodshed with firewood. This is from the dog's point of view. Again, the dog took note of the fact that he didn't do any of those things. The woods were alive with quail and pheasant, and he didn't go hunting. So, one of the final stages of Clarence Smith's fall, or failure as a human being, or ultimate self-destruction, is his disconnection from the natural, rural world around him. The rural experience, the closeness, the interaction with nature, generally, not always, but generally in the text we've read, has been a calming effect, has been a way to create stability, right? In Bless Me Ultima, there's the love of the land. Even his father, who is more restless, has a love of the Llano, which centers him. Jesse Bentley is very much attached, places religious significance on his farmland. And so here, one of the things that finally unmoors Clarence Smith and removes his stability is he is no longer aware of the natural world, of the land around him. That reads very heavily symbolically, I think, because especially as we study the rural, that loss is one of the most profound losses. It's a loss that you tend to see when you are removed from the rural, but he is losing it without being removed. And that, I think, is part of the tragedy. And before this chapter ends, we come back a last time to the dog. And it's very easy to read the dog as overly sentimental, that Maxwell is trying to get us to shed a tear or to feel rather than think. But I think that is a deceptively simplified reading. So we get this passage, which on some level reads that way, but listen carefully. So she, the dog, waited a long, long time, trying not to worry. This is when she's been tied to the stake and more or less abandoned. Trying to be good, trying to be especially good, and telling herself that they had only gone into town and were coming right back, even though it was perfectly obvious that this wasn't true. Not the way they acted. Eventually, in spite of herself, the howls broke out. Sitting on her haunches with her muzzle raised to the sky, she howled and howled. And it wasn't just the dog howling, it was all the dogs she was descended from, clear back to some wolf or other. So what do you make of this? I mean, it is very emotionally affecting, but I think Maxwell's up to more here. The dog ultimately serves as a symbol, because this novel has really been about um, not just loss, but loss as viewed by the most innocent and simple among us, right? Um, 8 or 9 year old William Maxwell loses his mother, right? Before he could really is equipped to understand what that even means. Cletus loses his family at roughly the same age, with no real ability to make sense of it. And now the dog has lost its family with no real ability to make sense of it, because obviously it's a dog. Um, so there's a through line running through these characters. And ultimately, I think they're all feeding back into this being a book about making sense of what can't really be made sense of. And when it says clear back to some wolf or other, I think the suggestion here is that we as humans have been around for a long time, and yet, when one of us suffers, it's the continuation of a chain of suffering. And in many ways, we're not better at making sense of it now than we were long ago. So the murder has happened. The fictional plot line invented by Maxwell has come to its conclusion. And we finally reach the final chapter, and I would say it's sort of the final reflective chapter. This chapter is very heavy, and old man William Maxwell finally, at long last, grappling with all of these things he's been trying to make sense of. It starts with him talking about how he does occasionally return to Lincoln as an old man, and how it confuses him. He says, "When I come upon the new hospital, I totally lose my bearings." In other words, the town itself has become unfamiliar to him since he left. And he still, we learn, hasn't made his peace with the changes from his childhood. "When I dream about it," he says, "his house, the proportions are so satisfying to the eye, and the rooms so bright, so charming and full of character, that I feel I must somehow give up my present life and go live in that dream house, that nothing else will make me happy." So, to him, home is not modern Lincoln. It's his childhood version of Lincoln. And ultimately, in considering this, he collapses the past and the present together. In talking to his therapist about his memories, he says, "I meant to say I couldn't bear it, but what came out of my mouth was, I can't bear it." So the pain of the past for him is also the pain of the present. All these years, and he still carries it with him. Um, so the idea of Lincoln then, Lincoln now, Maxwell then, Maxwell now, it all starts to coalesce and collapse on itself. And I think this is very much a comment on the fact that, um, especially in rural places, the past is never completely eclipsed by the present. Uh, Rural culture has always lived somewhat in its own past. And as Maxwell closes the book, we get this passage referring back to the sculpture that I showed you earlier. "In the palace at 4 a.m. you walk from one room to the next by going through the walls. You don't need to use the doorways. There is a door, but it is standing open permanently. If you were to walk through it and didn't like what was on the other side, you could turn and come back to the place you started from. What is done can be undone. It is there that I find Cletus Smith." And I would argue this is maybe the central moment of the book. And why is that the case? Well, because this sort of imaginary place that he goes to in his mind is the place where he can uh, move both forward and backwards in time. He can go back and deal with the things in his past. And I think to fully understand this passage, you need to compare it to some passages we saw earlier. For example, this from the second chapter that we saw early on. "I had inadvertently walked through a door that I shouldn't have gone through, and couldn't get back to the place I hadn't meant to leave." So, in his real life, once he went through the door, it was impossible to go back through it. And yet, in his idealized version of the palace at 4 a.m., he can move freely, not just back through doors, but even through the walls, which are open and available for him to move through freely. And he says, "This is where I find Cletus Smith." And if we think of Cletus as something of an extension of Maxwell, another version of that childhood that has been broken and traumatized, that he can go back and make sense of that in a way that He couldn't for a variety of reasons, many affected by the sort of rural setting of his upbringing. And finally, also compare it to this. I also clung to the idea that if things remained exactly the way they were, if we were careful not to take a step in any direction from the place where we were now, we would somehow go back to the way it was before she died. So, as a child, Maxwell was afraid to move in any direction for fear he would move further from the past he wanted to return to. But again, in the palace at 4 a.m., he can go wherever he wants. There's always a way back. So, to close, in some ways, is this book an attempt to return to the past that he, and I would say as well Cletus, lost? Is this Maxwell's purpose in moving from fact to fiction? I think in both cases the answer is yes. And it is wrapped up in the idea of the rural experience and how it created this difficult situation, and how, on some level, the rural is all about returning to a past that possibly never quite existed in the first place. So it's a lot of lecture. I appreciate you making it to the end. So we'll stop there, and I hope you enjoyed So Long, See You Tomorrow. And I think that's it. So tune in next week. We will move on, I believe, to In Country. And if you have any questions, post them in the threads or shoot me an email. Have a good week.